Thai prisons are terrifying. In the scorching summer, hundreds of prisoners are crowded together without any beds. The air is filled with various unpleasant smells, such as sweat and foot odor. Prisoners have no human rights. At night, the protagonist discovers that the inmate next to him has died. He is not surprised at all because in this prison, death incidents are nothing out of the ordinary. The prison guards handle dead bodies like packing a chicken. The protagonist is the only white person in the prison. On that day, he went to fetch water with his cellmate. The person behind him kept pushing him, and he couldn't tolerate it, so he got into a conflict with the person. As a result, the prison guard, without distinguishing right from wrong, locked him up in a dark cell. After staying there for 3 days and 3 nights, the main character was sent to the maximum security prisoner's cell. This place can be considered the hell in the prison, where they imprison extremely wicked people. As a newcomer, the main character was destined to be bullied. It is said that he used to be a sailor, so a group of people forced him to do push-ups. In such a harsh environment, in order to survive, one must surrender. The male protagonist was driven into a small corner, struggling to survive. And at night, it was the most terrifying. He had his mouth and nose covered by someone, threatened with a small knife not to make a sound. Use your imagination to figure out what these villains are doing. The next morning, the humiliated newcomer was found hanged in the cell. The prison guard came over without asking anything, skillfully packed up the body. But these villains came to warn the male protagonist that he would be the next one to die. From then on, every time night fell, the male protagonist was filled with fear. On this day, he went to the medical room to get 2 packets of painkillers, but the medical staff wanted to charge him, while it was free for others. Obviously, the white people here were subjected to racial discrimination. The male protagonist couldn't control his emotions anymore and got into a fight with a group of prison guards, even biting one guard's neck. At this moment, he was like a wild beast gone mad. As more and more prison guards arrived, the male protagonist was eventually subdued, beaten and put on a stretcher. In the prison cell, the male protagonist began to realize that he would eventually die here. The wound had not healed yet, and the male protagonist was put back in the high-security prison with ankle chains. Due to the previous violent incident, everyone now regarded him highly and did not bother him anymore. In order to make himself safer, the male protagonist started associating with these hardened criminals, spending their days together and even buying a pack of cigarettes to please his fellow inmates. Until one day, the male protagonist saw 3 inmates using a human ladder to remove the roof fan blades, which made him feel uneasy. True enough, shortly after, the alarm sounded, and those 3 prisoners didn't intend to escape, they killed 3 prison guards instead. The prison guards gathered all the prisoners and began to search them. Since they couldn't find the killer, the guards randomly grabbed a scapegoat who was rumored to have false intentions. Soon, there was a heart-wrenching cry on the radio, and the prisoners were beaten to death. The male protagonist began to realize that human life was worthless in this prison. One day, the cunning guard approached him and knowing that the male protagonist had a history of drug addiction, he gave him a bag of flour as soon as they met. The guard knew that he could only make the male protagonist rely on him in order to get him to do things for him. As expected, the guard soon had the male protagonist help him kill 2 prisoners. The male protagonist was initially resistant, but a few days later, the drug addiction slowly took hold. He could no longer resist the temptation and found the 2 prisoners, brutally beating them to death. The prison guard was pleased to see this. Afterwards, the male protagonist felt deeply guilty. In order to prevent himself from further deterioration, he chose to commit suicide by cutting his wrists. Fortunately, his cellmate discovered him in time and saved his life. On that day, the male protagonist saw a passing fleet of ships, reigniting his hope to live on. In order to change his current situation, he bought a ship ticket, but was immediately kicked out by the coach as soon as he entered. He didn't back down and ran to the store in the prison. Burned a cigarette and gave it to the coach, and then reluctantly entered the ship airport, but the coach did not really want to teach him, but found a senior ship driver and wanted him to retreat naturally. In the end, the male protagonist was beaten with a blue nose and swollen face. After returning to the cell, the inmates knew that he was playing the boat. They laughed at him. People who are chaotic and degenerate in the community, how can you understand the efforts of the male owner? In the following days, no one taught the male protagonist and he practiced desperately on his own. He quickly caught the attention of others nearby, and the coach was deeply moved and started teaching him the correct punching technique. After practicing the punches, he began to learn grappling techniques, which consumed even more physical strength and was crucial in restraining opponents. Soon, the male protagonist's rapid progress won the coach's approval, and he also won his first match. As a rower who hadn't competed for many years, the male protagonist's eardrum was broken as soon as he got on the boat, followed by being hit repeatedly. If you have someone around you who is decadent and fallen, you must watch this movie. His ears were torn apart and blood flowed out, while his opponent was unharmed. The match continued, and the opponent's attacks became even more fierce. But relying on strong will, when the opponent's stamina was exhausted and his guard was down, a heavy punch knocked the opponent down, and he couldn't get up again. He won the match, and cheers came from all around. Later, the warden called the protagonist and wanted him to participate in an important league. He would also be the first representative to enter the initial battle as a white person. If he was willing, not only could he transfer to a better prison cell, but he could also be released early if he won. Before the male protagonist left, the hardened criminals looked at him differently. The male protagonist, who was once mocked, is now the first person to walk out of the prison for hardened criminals. Next, the male protagonist trained harder and harder, not only receiving better striking training, but also having someone massage and relax him after training. However, this person who wanted to turn over a new leaf unexpectedly had a breakdown during training and brutally attacked his teammate, and was ultimately temporarily put back in prison by the prison guards. Here, he reflects on his actions, deeply blaming himself, venting his frustration against the hard wall, and swearing never to touch drugs again, or else he will never have another chance in this lifetime. After adjusting his rest, he returned to the assault team again, and a group of people gathered around and scolded him. Facing the teammate he had injured, he expressed sincere apologies. Seeing his serious attitude, the teammate chose to forgive. He started to get back on track, but while practicing, he ran to the toilet and spat out blood. The doctor told him that all his left ribs were fractured and his internal organs were severely damaged. If he continued to engage in assaults, his life would be in danger at any time. After coming this far with great difficulty, how could he be willing to give up easily? Soon after, the time for the prison's combat league arrived. The male protagonist got on the car and arrived at another prison, where his opponent was the top inmate of that prison. For prisoners, there were no rules to speak of. The male protagonist was kicked in the left ribs and fell to the ground. The opponent discovered his weakness and continuously attacked his left side. The male protagonist could only barely sustain and delay the time. Finally, when the referee rang the bell, the opponent unethically ambushed him. The coach was furious. There was nothing the opponent could do. This was just a prison for a group of poor and evil people. After the adjustment, the game entered the second half. The male protagonist was forced into the corner, can't fight back. The sight in the corner of his eyes began to blur. Find the right time to knock the opponent down. The opponent can't stand up anymore, even he can't believe himself. Actually won the game. There were shocking cheers from the audience, and before the male protagonist had time to be happy, he suddenly vomited blood from his mouth, fell to the ground, and woke up again and was already lying in the hospital outside the prison. But when he walked out of the ward, he found that there was no warning here. A bold idea filled his mind. He walked downstairs and freely walked on the street. As he walked, he stopped and asked himself, is it really meaningful to return to society like this? So he returned to prison, giving up his freedom. His father, who had once abandoned him, came to visit him in prison, with a look of affirmation in his eyes. If you are still full of disappointment in life, you might as well watch this movie. Perhaps your life will change.